Good morning, everyone. Let's please get started. If you have a moment, please take a seat. I'm excited to be here today to introduce you to our speaker, Peter Vanna. My name is Jennifer Wardle. I'm a planner and a member of the APPI Conference Committee. Today's session will be all about rural resilience through a modern Municipal Government Act. Our speaker, Peter Vanna, has nearly 40 years of experience. He is currently the Director of Growth for the City of Wetaskiwin. Peter has worked on many intermunicipal development plans and ICF frameworks across Alberta. One of Peter's recent interests is how rural communities can approach the challenges associated with changing environmental, economic, and social change issues. One question he'll ask today and discuss is whether or not the new Modernized Municipal Government Act represents a path forward, or is it simply another layer of added planning? Would you please help me welcome our speaker, Peter Vanna.
Good morning. So as the first slide indicates that Nick Price was supposed to be my co-presenter, but due to some family illness, he had to leave. But he did give me permission to do his in New Zealand slant when I get to his slides. But I promise you I won't attempt that. Don't want to offend anybody here. So before we sort of get kicked off here, just curious in the room, how many people have worked on intermunicipal development plans or ICFs? Wow, good crowd. And out of that, how many people work for municipalities that are outside of the Metro Edmonton, Metro Calgary area? Good, excellent. So really, today is about how do we, or really does the Municipal Government Act really represent a path forward in terms of trying to create more resilient communities, or is it really about a piece of legislation that's just another layer of planning that we have to consider? So one of the first things that we really need to consider is what's the state of our communities today, especially in the rural areas. And what we're really seeing is we're experiencing communities that are losing their population, losing their business base, struggling to make ends meet on their own. In fact, difficulty finding ways to finance infrastructure projects, do rehabilitation. Therefore, it forces them to have difficulty in terms of getting finance for their municipalities. And so it really sort of begs the question, where do we go from here in terms of our communities? One of the things that I did here was did a bit of a chart that looked at the number of cities small cities and large towns in rural Alberta and what their state of population growth was. And as you can see from the slide, it's pretty flatlined. They haven't grown, and in many cases they've actually declined in terms of population. And so that really speaks to that whole issue about the state of the current municipalities out there. In addition to that, a lot of municipalities, not only in Alberta but around the world, are facing issues of climate change and the climate change impacts. And you see that, being in Wood Buffalo, I mean, here's a place that has experienced a lot of that. So whether it's drought, whether it's flooding, whether it's forest fires, certainly these have had huge impacts on our ecosystems, and it does affect our resiliency as communities. So that takes us to really looking at the legislation of the Municipal Government Act. And so, the province a couple of years ago modernized the Municipal Government Act and kind of looked at it from the standpoint that said, this endless fund of grants to municipalities is really a point where we can't afford that. And municipalities sort of have to figure out a way to sort of work together in order to help sustain themselves, not only in urban areas, but largely in rural municipalities as well. And we need to identify ways of looking at the economies of scale when we're looking at communities to try and get them to work together. So as many of you know, looking at the legislation typically talks about future land use, the manner in which development will occur in our communities, proposed transportation systems, how we cooperate as municipalities, environmental matters, and also, my favorite, the catch-all related to physical, social, or economic development in our communities. Just out of curiosity, so in preparing your intermunicipal development plans, how many of your municipal development plans have factored in those aspects of economic development and social development? Okay, a couple. So one of the things I've experienced in looking at it, as I've been doing them and as I've been watching other municipalities do them, is that they've largely been an exercise of, here's the border. Yep, we need to do a intermunicipal development plan, so let's check off the box, right? We'll take our existing MDP over here, we'll take our existing MDP over there, we'll kind of mash it together and say, yeah, where are the commonalities, and Bob's your uncle. There you go, there's our plan. So at the end of the day, when you do it that way, you have to ask yourself, really, what are we achieving, right? Doesn't matter the fact that, the province is trying to get you to work cooperatively, to kind of figure out how you're going to amend your plan in the future and how you're going to administer your plan. The old days are the fact that you put your MDP on the shelf and that's where it sat for 4 or 5 years until you took another look at it, or unless you had to amend it. Really, what the proposed amendments were trying to do is to say, okay, you need to sort of figure it out into your work programs, into council strategy, to how they're going to work together. But the real question is, is that really what we're achieving? Or are we just simply rearranging the chairs on the Titanic? Is this a voyage for disaster? Or is this really something that's going to change how we plan in our rural communities or when we're adjacent to communities? So just out of curiosity, how many people think that we're just rearranging the decks on the Titanic? A few brave souls. Very good. Well, let's take a journey, okay? So, the place I like to start is, let's look at what the literature has to do. Let's look at the people that have sort of studied the issue, and to see, what is rural resilience? How does it work? How does it affect our communities? How do we apply it to what we're trying to do? So really what I want to take a look at today is sort of defining what resilience is. What does change really mean in our communities? And what are some of the principles and factors that sort of work towards having change in our community? So the first thing is trying to define what resilience is. So your standard definition of resilience is really about groups or communities that face external social, political, environmental change in their communities. And that sounds about right when you look at it just in terms of face value, but it is a little bit more than that. So really about how we looked at things this morning, we talked about change and how the rapid change, and really it's about, are we trying to change back to where we were in terms of achieving resilience? Or are we trying to move ahead, change the paradigm, change the way we think about things? So there's really there's a number of theories on it, a number of definitions of how you look at it, but there's two primary ways of looking at it. The old school way is kind of saying, there's an equilibrium, we're trying to get back to where we were. And then there's an evolutionary resilience. Evolutionary resilience is kind of moving that, it rejects that notion about trying to get back to where we were. It's about, we can't go back. As much as we'd like to, as much as we dream about what the past was like, we'll never get to that same point. So what we need to do is reinvent ourselves, recreate ourselves. And so this whole notion about the way we structure things, we need to evaluate what we're doing, we need to evolve, we need to change, we need to improve what we're doing, and ultimately bounce beyond where we were before. So then we look at some of the factors that deal with change. And certainly, as every community here probably has experienced, change is disruptive, and it doesn't really matter if your community is in decline or if your community is in rapid growth. The thing that really the difference becomes in the sense that a lot of rural municipalities, rural decline is a slow, painful death, right? Or it can be a slow, painful death, whereas rapid change is one where you can't keep up with it in large growing communities. You can't keep up with the infrastructure changes, and so you have these two paradigms in terms of trying to deal with change. The other is looking at the aspects of control. So control of whether you're a municipal government, control if you're an individual living in and working in some of these communities. It's about having agency in your community to actually experience or influence some of that change. Some of the things we can influence, some of the things we can't. So the next one is just in terms of process. And resilience really is a process. It's a process about, how do we create positive change? How do we harness the positive resources that are in our community and try and reduce the vulnerabilities that are impacting our community? So really about that, creating that human agency in our community. And it really is about trying to imagine and advance the notions of where do we want to get to in order to have a better community, have a better region that we live in. So when we look at the policies that, or the principles that generally bind this, there's 5 principles that the literature tells us that define resilience. And one is that it creates a positive vision. You have to have the positive vision and positive direction for a community in order for it to advance and to have something to achieve. The second is you have to learn to adapt, learn to reorganize yourself, recreate yourself. Secondly, it's that notion. Thirdly, it's that notion about bouncing forward that I talked about in terms of defining resilience. Can't go back to the past. Can't go reinventing the past. You need to reinvent yourself into the future. And secondly, it's about how do you mobilize the resources in our communities. And it's not just government resources. It's just not the resources that you may have in your town halls or county halls. It is about the resources in your community. So whether that be community groups, whether that be non-governmental agencies and so forth, how do we harness that community in order to help us collaborate to create something better than we had? Look at some of the things that are keeping us down, some of the things that are inhibiting us from growing, and trying to work together to collaborate to create something different. And when we look at that, we think about how do these different things work together to interlink and to support these factors. And so when we look at that, we look at factors such as social capital and cultural capital in our communities. And those are a lot of things that planners just typically don't consider. A lot of it may be, we do our land use planning, we do our economic development, we factor these aspects into it, but how often do we even consider the social capital that's in our community? So how many people understand what the term social capital means? Okay. So for those of you that don't, social capital and harnessing that is really, there's 3 levels of social capital. There's the one-on-one relationships that each of us have within our communities. There are the next layer where we have interactions with the community groups and organizations that are in our community and how they interact with one another. And thirdly, there is municipal government, or there is government, that really then how does it relate to the other levels that we have. And so by harnessing and working with each other and collaborating, that's how we build that. And also that's part of looking at that political and financial resources that we have in our community. If we have relationships with our business community, if we have relationships with our NGOs, those are some of the resources that we need to harness. We also need to harness some of the natural capital that we have in our communities as well. And it really looks at, and that really speaks to at the end of the day, placemaking. One of the important factors and one of the important relationships that people have to where they live is that sense of place. And what does it mean to you, right? And so people try and hang on to that. People try and reimagine what does that mean in their community or for their community. And so sense of place is a really important grounding for a place to start in terms of rural resilience. And in terms of common values and common beliefs, when you look at rural communities as regions, you get that sense of there is a common culture, there is a common values that people in certain areas, they may be cattle ranching areas, they may be farming areas, they may be oil resource communities. They tend to hold those common values that they have in a community. And then it is about community infrastructure. So it's not just the physical pipes in the ground and those type of things. It is about that community and what the community infrastructure, whether it's the church groups or whether it's the community groups to have in your community and the resources behind it. And that ability to really look at the notion about when we're looking at the resilience into how do we get beyond just getting back to where we were, how do we get to that bounce back attitude of working with our local businesses to understand, how can we think of things differently? So many times planners are stuck in the regulations that say, these are the way we're doing it, or these are the policies that we have. So a lot of times if you want to think about something different, you're going to have to change it. We're going to have to be more free thinking about innovative ways to do not only the way we govern, but also the way we deal with businesses and how we promote them within our communities, how we work with them on a great idea that they may have that may not fit our rules, right? Try something different. And also the next thing is leadership. And so leadership isn't just about, the politicians. It's not just about, the city manager or the town managers. It's at all levels of our community. There are leaders at the high school level, there's leaders at the community level, there's leaders at the communities, organization levels. Those are the type of leaders that we need to harness in our communities in order to get to something different. So in kind of looking at how do we move forward on this idea, one of the things I looked at was the Alberta Centre for Sustainable Rural Communities. They did some collaboratives not too long ago where they went to different corners of the province and got different people from different backgrounds, whether they be part of government, whether they be part of organizations, and went through some exercises, some collaborative exercises whereby they began to sort of try and understand what does it mean to live in a rural area? How do we grow in a rural area that's declining? How do we change that paradigm? And so really one of the things that they were identifying was, what are the areas that are of high risk? What are the areas where we try and collaborate with one another? What kind of different groups do we need to collaborate in order to bring about real change? And, they identified those high impact areas. If we're going to make some meaningful changes, what are they? And so they went through the principles, they identified, impacts on the regional level and started to think, how can we think more regionally as opposed to thinking about individual municipalities? Because so often one of the barriers to any kind of growth in rural areas is this individualization of communities to think, we don't need these other communities around us we can just continue to do it on our own the way we've always done it. And that's that whole mentality about, always reflecting or living in the past. And so it really was about then identifying what the trends are in those communities and identifying some examples that were in and around them that they could then reflect on to say, what did they do that we might be able to do? And so out of this collaborative, there were some common themes that sort of came out of this. And we heard a little bit about this morning, but this notion about access to transportation, about education, and access to education in our communities, access to health services in our communities, access to general services in our communities, and of course, access to broadband. Access to broadband is probably one of the biggest hindrances in rural areas because many people still believe it's a nice thing to have. What do we need it? Everybody just watches Netflix on it anyway, right? So what do we need it for? There's that little appreciation that, rural areas can compete. They can be progressive. Just give them the right tools, right? The other aspect was this whole thing about regional identity and getting past this notion about individualistic communities, but thinking more regionally. The aspect of even administrating, how we even govern ourselves. So the aspect that, instead of having a individual water systems, you may have a regional commission that provides water, provides waste, provides wastewater, those type of things. And even thinking about, and to do that, of course, you have to think beyond the typical political 4-year cycles, right? So many times at the political level, it gets sort of stuck into the fact that, well, here's our 4-year strategic plan. We're stuck in the 4-year plan. We do everything to gear our whole communities around this 4-year plan. And then when the new council comes in, we kind of throw that out. Well, we sort of have to think beyond that, right? And if we're going to think regionally, we really have to throw out the notion about a 4-year plan. We really have to think regionally about how, as a region, we're going to function together. And the last point that they sort of came up with was this notion that, a lot of the rural communities are not going to be able to grow within. There's just not enough population growth within these rural communities to have that rural growth. So we're going to have to become more welcoming communities. We're going to have to welcome people from all over in order to help integrate them into our community or help be in our community and welcome them into our communities in order to have our communities grow. So what I wanted to do now was to go walk through a couple of different case studies. These case studies aren't necessarily about here's the right thing to do or here's where we want to get to, but they're sort of examples of things that were started, that were done right, and have possibilities. And perhaps we can reflect on these to think about how can we do planning better in our communities. So how many people know where Flagstaff County is? All right, a few people. So one of the areas that I want to talk about first is Flagstaff County. And this is really a community or a county which had 4 villages and 4 towns within it, or have. And they're coming to a point where, they're facing those same rural issues that many rural communities are facing. The rural depopulation, losing business, aging population, basically an infrastructure that they can't keep up with. And so, and of course the last one. So when is the last time you heard your ratepayers in your community say that it's okay, we don't need as much? Okay, I don't see any hands up, so that must mean that they're always looking for how do we improve our community, how do we have more services, because they're always looking to the community down the street, right? Oh, they got a new swimming pool. Oh, therefore we must need a new swimming pool. So that whole notion about that continued demand. So really, what they did was the purpose of the partnership was the fact that it wasn't about amalgamation, it wasn't about annexation, it wasn't about losing people's identity of what they were. But what it was a different way of thinking about how they approach things. And so really what they did was they looked at things more from a regional perspective. They wanted to see, how can we improve the services that we provide? How can we think about different ways of providing it? How can we, instead of one municipality or 2 municipalities going to the province and saying, we need grant funding for this, now it is a region that is coming to the province and saying, what, we need infrastructure grants for fire services or for water services or whatever. And so it became a lobby instrument for them as well, but it also became a way of collaborating with one another. Some of the things they were able to accomplish was the fact that a number of projects, whether it's emergency services, emergency response, regional water and sewer systems, updating land use bylaws, thinking about how to do things more strategically together as part of a strategic plan. And it's interesting, what's interesting in this particular case study is that these municipalities sort of worked kind of slowly. They started in about 2003 and sort of are continuing today to move the ball along, to get to a point where it's really interesting where the public's response to this is that, well, hurry up already, right? What are you waiting for? Let's become one municipality, or let's become the one region, and let's get it all together, right? So it's interesting, the paradigm of how people think and how the people in your municipality think versus how the people who govern the municipalities think. And so other things that they were able to achieve in terms of regional water and wastewater treatment, those type of aspects, were all like really good things to do. And at the end of the day, it helped them on their journey to become more regionalized. Right now, they're looking at an operations plan to see, how do we almost create one governance unit that makes sense, instead of having all these seven different pieces of governance that govern our communities. So they're looking at that now to become more efficient. The next case that I wanted to take a look at was Greenview and Valley View. So this is where Nick was supposed to come in, so I won't do my Kiwi accent for you. But it's kind of interesting because Nick had a little bit different perspective on looking at the case in how we do our intermunicipal development plans. Very similar in the sense of there's a process that typically happens when you do IDPs, and that's to involve the councils, the administrations get together, then the councils get together. They look at the standard issues of land use, transportation, what services do we provide, et cetera, et cetera. Then they sort of go away, create their policies, have an open house. Yay, we're done. This was a little bit different, right? And so in this particular case, they created a citizens panel. They kind of said, we need the input of the public to maybe make this a little more robust, to make this system work a little bit better. And what was interesting that they found was that the public maybe had a different idea than the politicians did in terms of what they needed to focus on. And one of the big issues that's in Valley View is the whole notion of a bypass. And so, talk about a lightning rod in your community. What's interesting is that the politicians were saying, okay, that's great, yeah, we need to plan for that and we need to work on that. Whereas the residents were kind of going, well, maybe we don't need a bypass. That's going to kill our community, and it's going to kill our region, because we won't be able to, everybody will sort of bypass us on their way to Grand Prairie. So it really became, what they ended up doing with the citizen panel was, in fact, creating two alternate scenarios. One to say, if we have the bypass, we're going to try to work on our land uses like this. If we don't get the bypass, or in the time period that we don't have the bypass, we're going to work on this kind of land use scenario. The other thing that they did was they looked at just the different kinds of policies that they had. And what was interesting in the sense of their policies, they looked at how can they coordinate with the citizens group to create more meaningful policies where they interact with the business community, interact with the community, to provide them with more meaningful policies than just say, yep, it's a land use policy, we're sort of done. So what they did was they identified that. But once again, what was the interesting part here is that the citizen group and the council didn't always agree, right? So here are these two councils trying to deal with their citizens and trying to say, how do we sort of marry the concepts or the policies? And so what they ended up doing was they didn't throw anything out, but it really became a degree of which they would try and deal with it. So in the sense of if it was that everybody was in agreement with it, it sort of became a shall statement. If they disagreed with it, it became sort of like if not all parties were on board, it became a may or should kind of a statement, to try and keep it in there and sort of work towards something. What's really kind of interesting as part of this debate, and if Nick were here, he'd probably take the stance that, councils are the authorities in the community. They are the governance makers, and at the end of the day, they are the ones that have to buy into the plan. I'll put the other hat on and I'll say, that's great in theory, that's great in a governance model, but I'm going to challenge the thought, right? based on the readings that I've looked at, based on some of the examples I've looked at, unless you actually engage the community, unless it is from a grassroots level upwards and involving the public, it really, to me, it doesn't matter what the governance does. The governance will actually abide by what the public is doing, ultimately, if there's enough pressure by the public to do that. So is it, so something to think about when you're doing your planning, right? Is it what's driving what? And how do we make change? How do we make change lasting? Because really, politicians come and go every 4 years, right? Citizens, they're bought into the community. They have a sense of place in their community. And so it's about how do we build upon that? How do we take that and use that as part of our resilience in our community? So these are just some of the other policies that were identified in terms of providing a framework for economic growth, utilizing bodies like the Agricultural Society and the Chamber of Commerce in order to help look at the strengths and weaknesses in the community, and then also looking at different policies in terms of exploring those opportunities, both at a, if you want to call it incubator stage, where at a very small scale, as well as trying to look at it from a larger diversification in the community. So I just want to leave you with this thought, and that is the fact that resilience has no meaning except in relationship to more or less desirable outcomes. It's defined in terms of having approximated desired outcomes or having distanced oneself from the undesirable. So thank you very much, and maybe any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you, Peter, for that really interesting presentation. Definitely a lot of parallels with our speech this morning from Doug. I'll be coming around with the microphone. Does anybody have any questions for Peter?
Yeah, Peter, I've done a lot of work. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I've done a lot of work in very, very small municipalities, summer villages, as I know that you have as well. And I think a lot of the issue with some of these communities is capacity. Like we talk about, we've got to get together with the economic development organizations or the ag societies or the recreational groups, but you're one guy or you're one girl running the show. So how do you make sure that these strategies of relationship building and making sure that those networks are established and maintained and continue to function past the approval of the plan?
Well, it's kind of interesting. It raises a couple of things, a couple of thoughts that I've experienced over the years. One of them is that you need to develop trust, right? There's many times when you might have a county, you might have a town, and there's always this animosity, right? The town thinks that, oh yeah, well that county's got lots of money, it can afford to do everything, and just give us some money, right? And we'll go away, right? Whereas the county's going, what the heck with this town, right? So, but it's really quite interesting, right? If they start the process by actually sitting down with one another and understanding what are the common issues, because surprisingly, when you really drill down to it, a lot of the issues are common to one another because they're in the same area, right? And in fact, when you look at a lot of rural areas, there's a lot of relationship in the sense of, people live in the country but work in town, or people work in town but work out in the rural area. And so they go, vice versa, shopping-wise, right? So it is about establishing that trust to begin with. The other thing that, when you look at the Flagstaff example is that, all those towns and villages by themselves didn't necessarily have the resources. They couldn't hire the economic development person, or they didn't have the person that had the technology expertise. But together, when they began to look at it as a region, guess what? The comment that came back to me when I was asking them the question was, it has really helped our community, because now we can pool our resources, and you know, we have one expert that can help all of the towns or help all of the villages and help the county. And so that really is that, you have to get past that point of it's just us, right? You have to work together as a region.
I'm a relatively new addition to Alberta, and one question on the ICF processes that's occurred to me as a Scottish exile is reorganization of boundaries. Do you think that would have aided these processes a little more if that had been a topic they'd look at? For example, as communities and regions evolve, some communities tend to look maybe to the north of their boundary or to the south of their boundary. Spatial relationships change. Do you think there maybe should have been a look at that question? Because in my time in my old country, I saw a local government top-down reorganized twice in my lifetime. Boundaries changed, powers changed, the whole thing.
Yeah, I agree with you absolutely. I mean, that's what, to me, one of the fundamentals of where, if we look at the IDP process and the ICF process, fundamentally, it's driving people to what your common boundary is. And what I'm saying is that, you know, that might be fine as an interface issue, but quite frankly, all the other issues that you have to deal with are regional issues, right? You just can't draw a defined boundary about it necessarily. It is a sphere of influence. It might be geographical, it might be economical, it might be a number of different factors, right? And I think that's where the natural boundaries really should be, and that's how you should be able to do planning. You should be able to do it at that regional level and harness your resources, common resources, regionally that way. And that way you become stronger.
Peter, you've talked about an active interface between two areas that we've had some legislation on for a while. Obviously, MDPs below the IDP and regional plans above it. I'd like your comments on how you see regional planning, when it ever gets done, influencing the whole IDP process and what happens with that, and then how you see IDPs actually going down and influencing MDPs. Because right now, we seem to be going the other direction. MDPs are going up in influencing IDPs, and that's not the hierarchy that the province has passed.
You know, thinking about it, I mean, I think fundamentally the way, and it's just my comment, is the way it was rolled out. It was sort of saying, thou shalt have an IDP and an ICF. And by the way, you got to have it in 2 years. So, and you got to deal with your next door neighbor, by the way. So, I mean, it was that kind of rollout that kind of said, it was forcing something that wasn't necessarily a natural fit or natural way of planning something. What was interesting in the work that the Center for Rural Sustainability looked at, one of the conclusions that they came up with was that if the province, the message to the province was, had the province looked at it more regionally, had it incentivized grants and different mechanisms to force communities to look at things or on a regional basis, then maybe our planning would have followed suit. Maybe the way we would have planned would have followed suit. I think, you know, fundamentally, you got to look back to the legislation and kind of say, you know, great intent. There's great intent there, and it makes sense. There is about economies of scale and about we need to rethink the way we govern and the way we provide services to our communities. But fundamentally, you need to provide that carrot rather than just beating them over the head with a stick.
Hi, Peter. Now, the first part of my lesson is going to be a comment. A comment just in the sense of we hear all these cliches about we are better together and we're stronger when we're together, a lot of those stuff, but again, you get into an engagement with communities and try to get them to address those issues, and the whole idea goes out the window, and that's a lot of challenge. But even in a municipality that's within a province. Now, let me fast track, and you know where I'm going with this. When you are in a place like Lloydminster, where half of your municipality is in Saskatchewan, and the other half is in Alberta. Now, although we have legislation in Alberta that supports all of these, and they're going the same line, but then on the other side, the neighbors you have don't have any allegiance to the MGA as we have it on this side. Now, how do you, and I know working together makes things move a lot faster, makes the region grow faster than they ought to grow, but is the challenging environment in terms of the legislative environment that both of them are, that is making a lot of things difficult. Even when you want to do it on your side, or the other side may be saying, well, we don't have anything, especially when there's going to be funding from their government. They say, no, we don't have any funding for this. There's nothing we can do with that. Yes, Alberta can give money to you, then you can do with that. But again, to how do we connect them together with that same common purpose?
Yeah, Lloydminster is always a good example. I remember when I was in Lloyd, even before I got to Lloydminster, they used to park somebody on the Alberta side because the guy from Saskatchewan was coming over to the Alberta side to buy his refrigerator, and he was getting around the tax, right? So they'd stop him at the border. So, I mean, that's how fragmented it was to begin with. But, I mean, in the time that I was there with groups like Community Futures and those regional groups, there was actually some good regional efforts. And it didn't matter if you were in Dewberry or if you're in Lloydminster or wherever, right? I mean, the notion was that you all did work together. And you understood that, yes, there might be some spin-offs into your community, but generally speaking, you all worked together for a common good, and you reduced your cost. And so it really, what I find is that it comes down to that attitude, right? And what was interesting this morning in the talk was that, we live in an age, in a century whereby, like I'm a dinosaur, right? I'm this white-haired guy, white guy who stands up here and kind of goes, this is the way it used to be. Well, you know what? It's irrelevant, right? Because of technology, because of things. The younger generation aren't necessarily bound to a geopolitical boundary, right? They look at things differently. They think, how can we deal with things more pragmatically? How can we collaborate better? And so that becomes some of the difficulty sometimes, is a sense of, the governance level is not at the same level as where the citizens are. And that becomes a real hindrance. And that's why I certainly advocate for the sense of how do we collaborate better with our communities within the region? Because the saying goes, there's only one taxpayer at the end of the day, right? Why would we build a swimming pool in every single community in this region when we don't need to? Or why do we need to have, the big soccer pitch in every community as opposed to, right? The notion might be a notion of specializing. It might be the notion of how do you collaborate? How do you share costs? Just simply from an economic perspective, it makes sense. I think what gets in our way is the whole ego issue, right? A lot of us don't want to give up control, right? And that whole governance issue is we don't want to give up control. Yet, are we really giving up control? That's the big question. Are we really doing that? Okay, sometimes, but you have mechanisms to try and deal with that, right? That's what the whole notion about collaboration and dispute resolution is all about. Yeah, people don't always agree, but you work in the mechanism so that it kind of forces you to work together better. And I think that's really the path forward.
Hello. I have a question. So I'm learning about the IDP process. So what is the role, because I thought there was a role of First Nations, Métis settlements within that ID process. So how is, I guess, can you share, because I noticed on some of the presentations it said collaborate with municipalities, but I didn't see like inclusion of Indigenous, the surrounding groups who are there beside maybe some of those places that you named. So I was just wondering how that role, like how you guys considered that in any, like I guess in any of your case studies.
My observation, and I know, like, the IDP process and the ICF process does not factor in First Nations. It just doesn't. And that's unfortunate because I work in Wetaskiwin, and so we have First Nations at our doorstep, we have First Nations in our community. And so it's difficult when it's a disconnect. But what's kind of interesting is kind of looking at a process like this. We recently had an issue where how do we deal with homelessness in our community, right? And the discussion went everywhere from here's a high-ticket item where we ship everybody away and forget about them to, oh, hang on, we need to get our community groups together because we need to help people. We need to help people that are homeless in our own community to be in our community. And whether part of that's First Nations and the homelessness in our community is part of that story. And how we work with them is part of that story. So it's outside of the IDP process, and it's unfortunate that it is that way, and it's unfortunate that we can't. It doesn't stop us from collaborating on other levels, and certainly that's what I see in a number of municipalities, is that they will work at a different level for whether it's trying to come up with agreements on utilities and everything else to see on common services and those type of things where they can. But unfortunately, it's not a formalized process.
Do we have any further questions before we wrap up the session? Not seeing any hands raised, so perhaps we could give Peter a final applause for his presentation. Thank you so much. And just a reminder, lunch will be served shortly in Saloon A and B, just down the hall on the right. And we look forward to having you back at 1 o'clock for the Housing for Health plenary session. Thank you.